Hello again and welcome to another CPD talk. My name is Jasmine. I'm a senior biomedical scientist in blood transfusion and the head of training for pathology. Today we're going to go through how to create and present an oral presentation. We're going to be covering what they're used for, what types of oral presentation there are, when each should be used, how to plan for an oral presentation, what other resources you need, what next, basically I couldn't come up with a good title for that bit, the summary, and then we're going to go and we're going to review this talk. So, what are oral presentation used for? An oral presentation is a method of disseminating information between groups of people. The type of people that you are presenting to will alter vastly what sort of presentation you are given. So it could be peers, it could be someone you're training, or it could be to people above you on the food chain, or finally just to people that you don't know at all. There are many forms of communication, and a presentation is not always the way forward. For example, if you want to share something about some statistics that is only going to take up a paragraph, then it's going to be a lot quicker to do an email. Or if you want to have a discussion with someone, then a one-to-one chat might be better. However, these methods of communication are not always the best. An oral presentation is a really good way of getting information to a bigger audience and being able to gauge their reaction to it at the time. What type of oral presentations are there? Typical one would be like this, where you have a visual guide like a PowerPoint and a speaker talking you through this. These are normally live, but obviously in this day and age they're switching over to being more and more automated and therefore recorded. You then also have something called a performance presentation. So these will include things like performances, exhibitions or demonstrations. And finally, you can just have a verbal one where you can either have one speaker just talking at you, or you can have a couple of speakers discussing a topic like a panel or a podcast if we're looking at things on the internet. Which type of presentation should you use? It completely depends on, again, who you're talking to and what type of topic you're trying to get across. If you have a topic that has lots of diagrams or is quite long, then it's a good idea to have a PowerPoint. This is so that staff can follow along, but also so that the person presenting has a prompt to ensure that you don't forget important information. Say there's a really long word that you're not very good at remembering. If you have it on the screen, then that's going to help a lot. If you're describing a topic that is more physical, like how to lift an object the correct way, then having a video with this information for you to talk through is probably going to be much more effective than just some written words. And finally, if you want something more fluid, where you have a back and forth, and the speakers can guide the talk, then not having a strict presentation format is beneficial to everyone, because it allows more of a flow and you're going to get better results out of it. For the most part in the lab, we use planned oral presentations with a PowerPoint aid. This is because normally when we're giving an oral presentation, it's for training purposes. So we're trying to train other members of staff on what's going on. Therefore, having the information up on the screen so they can see it as well really helps. And conversely, quite often the members of staff giving the talks are learning themselves. So having something again on the screen to prompt them is really useful. Regardless of whether you are using an oral presentation with a PowerPoint or one of the other formats, you still need to review your topic and split it into bite-sized chunks. The way that you do that can then be put as your second PowerPoint presentation slides. So like in here where I've gone through what we're covering, the first thing I did was have a look at what I thought was important to planning an oral presentation. You will need to introduce people to the topic who may not be familiar with it. So this is going to involve finding words that are not commonly used, going through background information, and generally explaining what you're talking about. So in this presentation, I explained what the different types of presentation were, when we would use them, just basically gone through the background of an oral presentation. And I'm now going into the section that's got the main point of the talk, and that how you structure that will depend on what you're discussing. But in general, you'll want to continue on from your introduction and explain what you are presenting in more depth. Once you've done this, if you have a case study, then you can either add this here or later on. And that will depend on what you're presenting. So if you're speaking about a disease, for example, then you could discuss the treatment of this. And that could either be before the case study, so say you're going through the background of the disease, how it works, then you might put the treatment in here, or after the case study to wrap up that case study and say, oh, the patient will probably get treatment in this way. Depending on what makes most sense to you, that is the option that you should choose. And finally, you want to summarize. So that will be revisiting the key points, adding in information that people should learn from this or take away into their everyday work, and finally giving thanks to those who are listening or asking if anyone has any questions. So, if we were to use ABO blood grouping as an example, the first things I would have a look at is what information I want to cover to introduce this topic. So, do I need to go through what an antigen is, what an antibody is, what the blood groups are, how in depth am I going to talk about this topic, and who am I presenting it to? If I am presenting it to a board of executives who just need to know the basics so that it can inform their decision on an analyzer, I'm not going to go into what an antigen and an antibody is because they're not going to care about that. But if I'm trying to train someone, then I'm probably going to go back to basics so that they are aware of how it works and therefore can troubleshoot when things go wrong. What's going to take up the main part of your talk? So again, in the APO scenario, do I want to have the main part where I'm talking about, this is the forward group, this is the reverse group? Or do I want to go and have examples of what things look like? Depending on the aim of the talk, this will then impact how I'm going to discuss the main bulk of information. Do I want to include a case study? And what sort of case study would I want to include, / how will I structure it? When you're talking about ABO grouping, if you're talking about just the normal, this is a blood group, having a case study probably isn't going to add that much to it. If you're going into abnormal ABO grouping, then having a case study and how we deal with it is probably going to be a bit better. Finally, next, treatment. There isn't treatment for ABO grouping, that's not how it works. But there could be other things you could add under this heading. So for example, if we did include abnormal blood grouping, that could have information about how we would resolve those. If we didn't have information about that, then we could have something about the ABO compatibility. There are a couple of different things that you could add in here. It depends on what direction you are taking your talk in. And in your summary, again, it will be what the key points are, if there is anything from this talk that you want people to use in their everyday work, and again, giving thanks. Come up with a basic plan of what you could do based on, again, the ABO idea. In the introduction, you can put in why we do the test, what the test is. In the main part, what is a forward and reverse group? How does this testing work? What would happen if we didn't do this? Case study, is it appropriate? Or would it be better to have just examples of the ABO blood grouping and the reactions you would expect to see? And treatment, could you add something about ABO compatibility? So once you've sorted that all out and you're happy with your structure and you feel like it makes sense, I would say run it through a couple of times, because you will find sometimes you've written it in a certain way, and then when you start to speak about it, you want to speak about things in different orders. It happens to me all the time, and then I have to flick backwards and forwards between the slides, which doesn't look the most professional, but it's not the end of the world if you do have to do it. When it comes to giving your talk, how are you going to know that people have understood it, and how do you know that they were listening? I'm sure you've all been in lectures or presentations where the lecturer is you just don't have the willpower to listen to them, and you're staring off into space, or your phone goes off, or you just have no clue what they're talking about, right? It's therefore important as a presenter that you are trying to keep their focus on you and that you are trying to get your point across. And resources that you can create can be a great aid to this. So, depending on who you are presenting to, different resources are going to be applicable. For example, if you're just trying to explain some statistics to a board of directors, you're not going to give them a question and answer sheet to prove that they've understood it. But you might give them a printout of some of the statistics so they can take it out with them after the meeting. However, if you're trying to educate people on a topic, then a worksheet can be a really useful gauge of how well they've taken in that information, not only for you, but also for them. It means that they can reflect on that and maybe do some extra research if they haven't understood it, or ask you questions afterwards. Resources can make a good presentation great. It also means that you've got people interacting more, and if you can get people to interact, they're going to remember it more as opposed to having someone talk at them. So if you have some time and understanding, then it can be really nice to make them. So if we were to go back to the ABO example, you could create a worksheet where people have to work out the blood groups based on the reactions. Or again, if it was more aimed at someone higher up, you could create a handout which has information on it. Not only that, but if you add a feedback sheet, not necessarily to that document, but to a separate document, then you know what you could improve on next time. Whenever you create a CPD talk, that goes towards your own personal development. It's a lot of work to create a talk. You have to do all of the research, you have to spend the time to put it in a logical format, and then you have to present it and be able to answer questions most of the time. Therefore, it counts as your own CPD. So having feedback will not only inform you for the next talk that you do, but it will also give you something extra to reflect on when it comes to making this a more robust piece of CPD. You've done your resources, you've planned out your talk, what else is there? Honestly, the biggest thing is to practice. When you create a presentation, your slides should be there to jog your memory and should not be there to be read off of. So you need to be confident in your subject matter. If you're just sitting there reading off the slides, then the people in the room aren't going to pay attention because they can read. You could have just sent them out the presentation, right? The more confident and relaxed you are when you're presenting, the more your audience will take away from the talk. The other thing that is important to do, although I haven't mentioned it yet, is to introduce yourself at the beginning. Sometimes this can seem a bit redundant if you're full of a room of people who know who you are. However, by introducing yourself, it sets the tone. It also allows you to just, start on something that you're going to know the answer to, right? So it should be something that's so ingrained that you're like, oh, hi, my name is Jasmine. So it's a nice little confidence boost to start you off. It also then means if you are presenting to people who don't know who you are, they'll be able to find you later and introduce themselves. Once you're happy with your preparation and you want to present, the next thing you need to do is arrange a when, where, who. So, as mentioned, before you create your presentation, you should know who you are aiming it at. It's then important that when you arrange a day to do it, that they're going to be able to attend. If I'm trying to create a presentation for people who are in training and half of them are on annual leave on the day I present, then I'm going to have to double the amount of work that I do. So it's really important to have a look at when you can get the most people in that you want to capture with your talk. In terms of when and where, most of the time in the laboratory you'd need to come and talk to a senior member of staff and we can book you into the seminar room or arrange for a talk to be recorded, depending on your preference. We are always happy to accommodate people presenting. It's nice to have a variety of people giving presentations, and it helps with other people interacting with them as well. Because where you've heard my voice on 17 videos now, I'm sure you're bored out of your mind with it. However, if you had someone completely new come on and talk, then that's suddenly going to be a bit more interesting. because they're going to have different mannerisms and different ways of presenting. So, in summary, once you have a date and you're happy with everything else, you just have to dive in. The more enthusiasm you have when you give the talk, the more you're going to engage with your audience, and the more they're going to take from it. Hopefully this has been a useful overview. Remember, have a logical plan. Your slides are there as prompt, not to read off of. You can normally read off the summary. There's not really much else to add. And enthusiasm is the most important ingredient. I now want to go back and have a look at this presentation as a whole and go through how this could have been improved. Were there topics that could have been covered better? Was the actual presentation of the talk good, or could there have been better planning? And was the structure logical? So I did this talk live to a couple of people yesterday. It won't be yesterday when this is uploaded, and we went through these together. Obviously we can't redo that online, but I'm just going to go through some of the things that I thought of when I made the talk and I totally purposefully left out, and some that they came up with. So in terms of how it could have been improved, someone raised that there could have been more photos and pictures, and they're right, there was a lot of text, very text heavy, and that can make a presentation a bit boring and dull. The other things is that there weren't any resources provided with this talk. Because I've done this once already, my presenting skills have been okay. However, when I first did it, I did flip backwards and forwards through a couple of slides because the order I'd put them in wasn't solidified in my brain. So that was a bit of feedback as well. In terms of what topics could have been covered better, I could have had an analysis of an actual presentation. That might have made it easier to see what I was talking about. Was the structure logical? In my mind, yes, it made sense to me. Whether it made sense to you listening or not, I don't know. There were a couple of bits where, for example, I mentioned introducing yourself at the end of the talk, so that could have been closer to the beginning of the talk. The point of doing this is to bring home that there's always a way that you can improve your presentation, and just because you missed out on a couple of things, it doesn't mean that it isn't a good presentation. It just means that you should learn from that next time. This is a talk that I put together very quickly the first time and at the last minute because I had planned to do it and then hadn't created the resources. So I missed a key element where I didn't do the planning phase. I've obviously had longer to look at it now, so my presenting is better. But if I had actually done that in the first place, then it would have been better for the people listening. Hopefully this has been interesting for you and it has helped. I know a lot of it is common sense, but sometimes we get so caught up on the actual science that we don't think about the rest of it. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next time. Bye!